Hello and welcome back to the Final 14 Years YouTube channel. I'm Daniel, and today's date is November 27th, 2025. Happy Thanksgiving, and thanks for joining me again as we continue to ponder the prophetic in this part 2 video of the previous video of the same title in which I posted last week on November 19th. Now let's dive in. Leaving off from part 1 to this video and other videos on my channel, we can see how King Solomon symbolically foreshadows the coming Antichrist and also that of the real Christ. In chapter 2 of the book of Song of Solomon, we see the prophetic pattern and season in which Christ and his bride finally meet via a subtle description of the rapture event in which she is called up to meet her beloved in the air of all places. Such detail is not arbitrary, but rather is giving us further clues and indication as to the approximate method and precise timing of season in which Christ will call his bride up to meet him in the air as he comes skipping over the mountaintops. When we couple this with the agricultural and prophetic fall season feast day patterns, the prophetic symbolism and timing of season of these events become much clearer. Details such as this indicate that the rapture of the church is not random nor imminent in its occurrence, but rather follows a precise prophetic pattern hidden throughout parts of Scripture that, if we look closely enough, we can uncover those hidden details that can give us further insight as to when and what is yet to come. Starting in verse 4 of chapter 2 of Song of Solomon, we see that Solomon, correlated to Christ, brings the bride to his banqueting house, correlated to the heavenly abode of Christ, in which he places a banner of love over the bride, which depicts how Christ will cover us, the believer, in his righteousness and not his wrath. Verses 8 through 10 describes the voice of Solomon as he comes in the air over the mountains and hills, spanning a proverbial gap between them, in which he calls for his bride to rise up and come away with him. We'll see in a moment how I think that this depicts how Christ is described to span the metaphysical barrier between himself and us as he comes into this realm to carry us away to his heavenly abode. Verses 10 through 13 describes details of the season in which this meeting occurs at, noting the specific mention of flowers, migratory birds, and the specific fruits of figs and grapes that are said to be present at the time in which the bride is called up and away. Again, these aren't arbitrary details. They are prophetic clues as to when the rapture will occur. For this to make sense, it's imperative that you understand the agricultural and ceremonial feasts of the fall season of the nation of Israel, as those two factors hold key details to unlocking these mysteries for our generation. As you can see in this little chart at the bottom of the screen, the prophetic fall feasts of the Lord, which prophetically foreshadow this unique redemptive event, occur during the same time in which figs and grapes are harvested, and which are also analogous to God's people. This association of detail is not a coincidence. Also note that the Song of Solomon chapter 2 named two precise locations within the nation of Israel that is linked with the taking of the bride. Verse 7 mentions Jerusalem, and verse 17 mentions the mountains of Bether, which are the Judean mountains just to the east of Jerusalem. These details are also crucial in that Matthew chapter 24 verse 7 states that Christ will come swiftly like lightning from the east to the west. And as we'll see next, Christ is said to come in the blink of an eye via the air and will change all believers in the twinkling of an eye into incorruptible bodies. Now, for those that either disagree with the concept of the rapture or believe that the rapture is imminent and or random in occurrence, I'd like to point out some key details within 1 Thessalonians chapters 4 and 5, in which we see that the concept of the rapture is a legitimate event in which we are not to be ignorant of. Scripture would not have detailed this if the rapture was either not real and or was randomly imminent, because if so, then we logically would and should indeed be ignorant of it. However, although mysterious at the time, the concept of the rapture was indeed taught and fairly understood in the early church, which was made evident via the apostles that stood gazing up at Christ during his ascension into heaven into a cloud. likely thinking that he was going to return at any moment to bring them with him, but were instead told to stop looking up by the angels, which then told them that Christ would return in like manner via a cloud. On the other hand, there is a generation that is told to look up when they see the precise signs that indicate that their redemption draws near, as recorded in Luke chapter 21, verse 28. Sadly, many choose to be ignorant of these signs as prophesied in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 through 5, which states that, "Know this first, that in the last days there will be scoffers, walking after their own lusts, that choose to be willfully ignorant of all the signs that herald the coming rapture event." Many erroneously think that Scripture doesn't give us heralding signs or events that lead right up to the moment of the rapture itself. In 1 Thessalonians chapters 4 and 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 52, each describe how the rapture is heralded by and correlated with a heavenly shout and with a sound of the last trump of God, in which both the dead and alive body of believers will be caught up together at and changed in the blink of an eye as we meet the Lord in the air. Christ even used the lives of Noah and Lot as being patterns to the coming rapture, in which God's wrath could not be poured out on the unbelievers while the righteous believers were still present, and therefore had to be taken out of the way beforehand. We also see another detail in which the rapture occurs at the last trump. Again, I think that this last trump is pertaining to the last trump of the series of trumpet blasts that occur during the fall feast days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and not the last of the 7 trumpet judgments of the tribulation period mentioned in the book of Revelation, noting that the church is said to be spared from God's wrath. Therefore, the purpose of the rapture is to spare the bride of Christ from the sudden outpouring of his wrath that is said to come upon the entire unbelieving world, whilst the believer is to be snatched up, out, and away from that sudden time of wrath, as it was in the days of Noah and Lot, which again proves that the rapture is not a randomly timed event, and that the watchful believer has always been forewarned and told to watch for the signs of that day approaching and to be ready to escape it. Luke chapter 21 verse 36 states that we must take heed so that day doesn't come upon us randomly, as it will be a global event heralded by overt signs in which we are told to watch for and pray always that we may be accounted worthy to escape from and to stand before Christ in the heavens, in which the bride will be with him forevermore from that point forward, and will return with Christ to the earth after the celestial wedding feast, in which Christ will fulfill the bride's bridal week in heaven during the 7 years of blessing that is said to occur for Israel on the earth, that is to immediately follow the destruction of the Ezekiel 38-39 Gog and Magog War, in which I believe that the rapture event will be synchronized with and masked by during the 3 prophetic fall feast days of the Lord of some year to come ahead. Now let's cover some key details within the book of Ezekiel chapter 38. First, we see that God is against an entity called Gog, which is the chief prince over 2 specific areas of Meshech and Tubal, within the land of Magog, which is likely a reference to modern-day Russia and its capital city of Moscow, and its second oldest city of Tobolsk. Noting that Russia is the largest country in the world by land area and is comprised of 85 different territories, with 22 of them being republics, which are separate nation-states with their own separate cultural identities to that of Russia, and happen to be in the far north region in relation to the nation of Israel. These separate ethnic groups within Russia are likely correlated to the phrase of many people with thee, as noted at the end of verse 5, which are listed in addition to other defined nations that are separate from Russia itself, but are just allies and not territories of or within Russia, such as Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, and etc. So I believe that this chief prince called Gog is a fallen archangel, principality spirit, per Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, that is the ruling demonic entity over the land area of Russia, or Magog, that will influence and control its leaders and allies' leaders and population to do evil things to the nation of Israel. The notion that Gog is a fallen archangel ruling over a precise land area comes from the book of Daniel in chapter 10, verse 13, which describes how the archangel Michael was referenced to as being a chief prince that battled with the demonic principality spirit that was over the kingdom of Persia, that was trying to hinder the prayers of the prophet Daniel. Next, we see how God states that he will use jaw hooks to turn Gog and his human avatar army away from one location and to another instead. This could indicate how that God may be using current and future geopolitical events to lure Russia and their various allies away from their current encroachment into Ukraine and Europe and to Israel instead. This could come by way of a well-coordinated multinational mobilization effort from the likes of the UN Security Council in response to the nation of Israel's eventual procurement of more land per the prophetic events as described in Psalm 83 and Isaiah chapter 17, in which describes how Israel will eventually overtake and consume their immediate bordering enemy neighbor states in response to their continued efforts to destroy the nation of Israel. This would likely trigger a far worse mass migration crisis of various Islamic and Arab groups out from the Middle East and into various nations around the world, which would surely result in a global economic crisis that will be blamed on the nation of Israel. This would trigger a spike in anti-Semitism around the world, which would result in many Jews from around the world having to return to the newly expanded nation of Israel. Just like in the pattern of the ancient Jewish exodus from ancient Egypt, due to the rise of anti-Semitism correlated to economic concerns at that time, the Jews inevitably left ancient Egypt with vast wealth, which further worsened the economic situation in ancient Egypt, which provoked an economically desperate Egyptian government to come take a spoil of the Jews that were fleeing, during which time God destroyed the pursuing Egyptian military via a supernatural event involving the waters of the Red Sea. So this pattern will likely play out again as described to occur in the Ezekiel 38 and 39 multinational invasion into Israel for a spoil, in which God will destroy those invaders with a series of supernatural volcanic eruptions, as we'll see in a moment. In verse 4, we see the phrase, hooks in thy jaws, which is derived from the Hebrew word used for a nose ring and jaw muzzle, which is a device used to control and lead bulls and cattle to this day. Therefore, it appears that God is correlating this principality spirit called Gog and his army with that of bulls or large cattle that he will lead into their coming fiery volcanic slaughter, as we'll soon cover. Next, we see a list of specific nations that are said to be part of the army of Gog. Now pay close attention to the significance of the precise nations that are listed and in the order in which they are listed in and or grouped by, as I do not think that such detail is arbitrary, but rather signifies their leading role of involvement and or proximity to the coming conflict with the nation of Israel. So Persia, which in 1935 changed their name to Iran, is listed as the first nation to join militarily with Russia, and then Ethiopia and Libya, in which we see Russia having geopolitical relations with all three of these nation states today. Next, we see the mention of Gomer and all his bands, in which I believe to be Germany and the EU member states under Germany, which Germany is the largest economy of the EU. Also noting that in the table of nations after the great flood in Genesis chapter 10 verse 3 mentions Gomer being one of the sons of Japheth, and therefore a grandson of Noah, had a firstborn son named Ashkenaz, in which the Jews that fled from Nazi Germany were known as the Ashkenazi Jews, which originated in Rhineland, which is now modern Germany. History shows us that Germany and many of the EU states indeed have a history and current issue with anti-Semitism that will likely only worsen as Europe receives more displaced Arab, African, Islamic migrants from the Middle East and Africa, in which Israel will receive the blame for. Germany and the EU are also having to side with Russia more so than the Western powers due to regional and economic energy concerns, as Russia is a major energy supplier to the EU, especially after the fall of Libya. Tagarma of the North Quarters and all his bands is likely referencing the nation of Turkey that was once the Ottoman Turkish Empire and its previous territories that are now the various Balkan nations, in addition to other regional nations that bordered the former Ottoman Turkish Empire there in the Caucasus, such as the nations of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, in which most of them are Islamic. All these nations are said to be prepared and to assemble under the protective guard of Russia, in which will be spiritually visited in the latter years of these last days, indicating that this is indeed a prophecy for this final generation, as they are described to come against a newly formed nation of Israel that is comprised of returned Jewish exiles from around the globe, which has only been evident since May of 1948. This multinational army is said to be brought down from the north into Israel's northern mountainous region. Noting that this prophecy was written by Ezekiel when he and the Jews were being held captive in Babylon, in which the land of Israel was just a small piece of the total land area that was under the rule of the singular Babylonian Empire. So, from that perspective, for Ezekiel to have described how that the nation of Israel would be one day reformed and that all Jews would be dwelling safely in Israel with unwalled villages is definitely a unique factor that only this generation can attest to. We then see that an evil thought enters into the mind of Gog and thus his wicked human avatar army that involves a collective blitz invasion into the northern mountainous territory of a newly reformed nation of Israel. This northern territory is said to be comprised of once desolate areas that would be newly inhabited with unwalled villages that will produce plenty of goods and specifically cattle that will be managed by Jewish people that have been gathered out of all the other nations. I believe this is reference to the various Jewish settlement areas called kibbutz and moshav that began to be developed by Jewish returnees from around the world that began with the first village of this northern region being established in 1967 within the highly disputed area called the Golan Heights, or in the Bible, Bashan. Syria has long since claimed the Golan as their territory and that they've wanted it back ever since they had progressively lost more of this territory to Israel as a result of the July 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 October Yom Kippur War. So the initial intent of this invasion into Israel's northern front might appear as a legit means and reason. At first, since the UN Security Council has long since sided with Syria over this disputed Golan Heights territory, in which Israel has rightfully refused to give up. So logic states that inevitably the nations will find the opportunity to come and seize the Golan by force, during which time it will be noted by the Western powers that it appears there is an attempt to take a spoil of and lay claim to that region's resources for themselves. Hence the coming description of how other onlooking nations will question the intent of this invasion into Israel. These disputed northern unwalled Jewish village settlements within the area of the Golan are very plentiful and productive in contrast to the surrounding devastated and arid Arab nation states that surround Israel. So their intent to seize control of this particular area and its vast resources for themselves will be fairly evident, and thus can explain the bait on the hook that God will use to lure them into their destruction as they come to attack Israel for to take spoil. So next, we see a different group of nations, starting with Sheba and Dedan, which are the Saudis and Emirate Arab states of the Arabian Peninsula. Then we see the merchants of Tarshish, which I believe is a reference to the economic leadership of Britain, and the young lions thereof, which are likely a reference to the former British colonies in which America is the most prominent. And notably, both Britain and America are integral into the refoundation of the nation-state of Israel. This triad of nations are indeed current allies of one another, and also have strategic interest in and or partnerships with the nation of Israel today, and are noted to only verbally question the apparent motive of the coming multinational blitz invasion into Israel by this Eastern coalition of nations led by Russia, which currently maintain a deceptive relationship with Israel while also being allied with several of Israel's worst enemies, such as Iran. Russia actually continues to maintain a small military presence of personnel there in southern Syria at Israel's northern Golan border, and even renewed some of their troops there this November 2025 for the sake of maintaining peace and safety between the two countries as Syria installs their new terrorist president. All the while, Russia is actively invading Ukraine with a Jewish leader, with the help of Iran and donated soldiers from other allied countries of theirs. So it doesn't take much to imagine how that God could use a sudden shift in regional events involving Israel that would quickly result in Russia and their prophetic allies turning their military attention back to the Middle East and toward Israel's northern Golan front specifically. During this coming attack upon Israel's northern Golan front, it is described that these presumed allies of Israel do not come to Israel's defense, but rather only question the motive of the attack. This could be due to the fact that this triad alliance is either unwilling and or unable to assist Israel. I believe that the Saudis, British, and Americans will be both unwilling and unable to assist Israel due to a global economic collapse that will likely be blamed on Israel due to the eventual worsening of conflict that they will likely be part of and that they have with their immediate Arab neighbors, which will likely justify and prevent Israel's allies from intervening on their behalf due to a UN Security Council motion to act against Israel, and will not be because of the rapture, as I think that a rapture event will come shortly afterwards during the destruction of the Gog and Magog army, which will be a massive enough event to mask the rapture during the fall season of some year ahead, when all this is likely to take place. So both a major geopolitical move from the nation of Israel against their Arab neighbors, as seen in Psalm 83 and Isaiah chapter 17, along with a global economic collapse, is what will likely trigger the Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog invasion into Israel, as the desperate allied eastern nations will likely feel justified and invigorated to come against a seemingly isolated and prosperous nation of Israel as fruit ripe for the picking, but will not realize that they are marching directly into a prophetic trap of their own demise. We can only see that this generation is likely to experience such an event, in that we see these conditions set in which Gomer and their bands, Germany and the EU, is being overrun by Islamic sentiment that are more likely to become the majority voice in Europe that will agree to side with Russia and their other Eastern Islamic allies for their coming collective attack against Israel. However, the merchants of Tarshish, Britain, are listed as being separate from that of Gomer and their bands, Germany and the EU, in this prophecy. I saw this years ago and assumed that Britain, while still a part of the EU at that time, would eventually have to separate from the EU due to economic reasons, noting the specific mention of the term merchants. Of all occupations, merchants was listed. It was those of the field of the economic business that would likely protest and cause the apparent separation of the two powers. This eventually became evident on January 31st, 2020, as Britain indeed separated from the EU via the Brexit by reason of their economic concern and how British funds were being used to fund the ever-growing expenses of Arab and African migrants that were continually flooding into the European Union. Needless to say, the occurrence of the Brexit only further authenticated and strengthened my interpretation of the trajectory of these prophetic passages here in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Then we see the specific mention of silver, gold, and cattle in that order, which also struck me as significant and further condoned the scenario of an economic collapse, in which if the Western-dominated global monetary system collapsed, silver, gold, and livestock prices would be the first things to skyrocket in value, in which could cause the Eastern nations to rush to invade for silver, gold, and cattle, in which Israel is described to have plenty of all those specific items, which would be highly valuable and would indeed be needed to target for procurement by these much larger nations than Israel amidst their desire to replace the global hegemony of the Western powers that will have collapsed. So such a scenario as this explains the desire for these nations to rush to take a spoil of these precise resources in which they will fight amongst one another to procure them, and are described to eventually turn on one another during the invasion into Israel. God has used similar tactics to defend Israel during ancient attacks against Israel, as described in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, in which God confused the armies of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, so that they fought amongst one another instead of being able to collectively attack Israel. Upon further research that I did to help explain why silver was specifically listed first, I found that there is and was a significant economic case to be made for silver having much higher percentage yield increase to that of any other commodity amidst a global fiat monetary collapse. However, gold and cattle would also skyrocket in value amidst a global fiat currency collapse. So the next question I had was, why and how would Israel have all this silver, gold, and cattle specifically for this Eastern coalition of nations to want to come and take away from them? The explanation to this also lay within the prophetic pattern of the Jewish exodus from ancient Egypt, in that the Jews were hastily expelled from an already suffering Egypt with tons of silver, gold, and cattle, as specifically mentioned in the book of Exodus chapter 12, verse 33 through 38. So the rise in anti-Semitism around the world will likely worsen amidst a coming time of global economic collapse that would have come just before the Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog invasion into Israel, would likely have allowed all the expelled Jews of this final generation to flee their host nations with all the silver, gold, and cattle as they head back to the nation of Israel to ultimately prepare to receive the Antichrist and false prophet, in which they will receive and give all their silver, gold, and cattle to, in order for the Antichrist and false prophet to start rebuilding the third temple and to restart the sacrificial system. Similarly, with the pattern of the supernatural Jewish exodus from Egypt, the Jews immediately used their newfound silver, gold, and cattle from Egypt to worship a false idol instead of the true God that saved them. Israel will do this once again after God supernaturally brings them out from all the world nations and back into this newly expanded nation of Israel with all the silver, gold, and cattle. And after God supernaturally defeats this northern army of Ezekiel 38 and 39, they will receive the Antichrist and false prophet that will build their idol of the third temple so that they can wickedly reinstate the sacrificial system. Notably, Israel currently has the best cattle and advanced dairy technology farms in the world in preparation for this, which are located right there in the unwalled villages of the highly contested northern Golan Heights region. Unironically enough, Russia in 2016 even signed an agricultural agreement with Israel regarding Israel's advanced dairy technology and farms there in the contested Golan Heights. Russia indeed has some vested interest in the Golan Heights region, as they fought hard for Syria during their civil war and didn't get much by way of compensation, considering that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad lost the fight for his country and now resides in Russia for asylum. And now Russia has to also face the repercussions of a costly and protracted war with Ukraine. So I think Assad is likely there in Russia convincing Russian leadership that their ultimate payday resides within Israel via the seizure of the Golan Heights, especially noting that back in 2015, U.S.-based energy exploration company Genie Oil and Gas, GOG, confirmed that Israel has a huge oil and natural gas deposit there within the northern territory of the Golan Heights. So the hook is set and appears to be these key resources in which Israel holds as an oasis within a desolate surrounding area. Russia and their end-time allies will eventually hit a breaking point at which they will easily be tempted by this evil spirit Gog to come against Israel for to take a spoil, which will be the biggest mistake that they could ever make, as God will sacrifice them as a burnt offering to his people Israel, which is highly symbolic to the timing in which this event will occur. But we'll discuss that later. As you can see here, Moscow is directly in the far north in relation to Israel and are clearly the dominating force in that region that is actively invading another nation at this very moment, Ukraine, and are being aided by the likes of Persia and many of the other Ezekiel 38 and 39 nation states. Russia also entered into the Middle East militarily to assist Syria during the height of the Syrian civil war on September 30th, 2015, which was 2 days after the last blood moon of 2015 during the fall feast of Sukkot of that year. Now, inevitably, Syria collapsed and the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, fled Syria for asylum in Russia, in which he still resides there to this very day, likely urging Russian leadership to come against Israel when they are done with Ukraine. All we are waiting on now is for the current geopolitical circumstances to suddenly shift, in which this demonic spiritual entity called Gog will visit and whisper into the ear of these regional leaders to convince them that the time has come to collectively invade the nation of Israel for the evil idea of taking a spoil from them. However, unbeknownst to them, they will be marching directly into the literal fiery wrath of God, as we'll soon cover in a moment. So as we saw in Ezekiel chapter 38, Russia, beyond all probability, is indeed presently aligned with Iran, Ethiopia, and Libya. Russian relations with Persia, or Iran, can be dated back as far as the 16th century. However, military relations between Russia and Iran slowly began to form as early as 1989, nearing the end of the Cold War with the West, and would often fluctuate over the years due to rival interests. But Russian-Iranian partnership has only ever been increasing since the 2011 Syrian civil war, in which Russia formally entered into Syria with their military forces in September 2015, during the time of the final blood moon of the fall season of Sukkot that same year. Iran also used the Syrian civil war as a means to covertly set up Iranian military forces there within Damascus in hopes of getting close enough to mount a targeted strike against the nation of Israel. However, these attempts were thwarted by Israel, and Iran retaliated in April of 2024 by launching their first ever direct large-scale ballistic missile airstrike into Israel from within the Iranian territory. Notably, Iran does not share any border with the nation of Israel. However, Syria does share a border with Israel, but are not named to be one of the nations said to join this Ezekiel 38 and 39 multinational attack against Israel. I think that this is because Syria is described to be a failed state, and currently is, in which will be eventually destroyed and overtaken by the nation of Israel in the coming years ahead, as prophesied in Isaiah chapter 17. Such an event will, of course, have major global economic and geopolitical and prophetic implications that will likely be one of several major factors that will be part of triggering the war of Ezekiel 38 and 39 against the nation of Israel. Iran has ancient historical ties with Israel, more so than Russia, in that Iran actually had good relations with Israel up until the 1979 Islamic Revolution within Iran that turned them against the Jewish state and the Western powers. In 2011, the Libyan civil war resulted in Russia being able to increasingly step into the chaos of Libya in order to solidify partnerships with the new military powers of Libya. Russian alliance with Ethiopia dates back to the late 1800s and significantly increased in 1974, and even today with being part of the BRICS economic bloc, which also includes Iran, but not Libya yet. These strategic alliances are surely not a coincidence, especially when prophesied thousands of years beforehand, and are now notably present and burgeoning after the May 1948 prophetic reestablishment of the nation of Israel within their ancient homeland there in the Middle East. Despite all the debates about the nation of Israel, the end-time reestablishment of the nation of Israel and it being the focus of the entire world was indeed prophesied to occur in the books of Isaiah chapter 66 verse 8, Jeremiah chapter 16 verse 14 through 15, Ezekiel chapter 36 verse 8 through 10, Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 1 through 14, and Zechariah chapters 12 and 14, is now an undeniable event of world history and current headline news. The reestablishment of the nation of Israel is also a milestone event that heralds the return of Christ, per Luke chapter 21 verse 29. In which Christ correlates the nation of Israel to a reborn fig tree that is joined with other reestablished tree nations that will expand and struggle over resources and will be the indication of the final generation that won't pass away until all the biblically prophetic things are fulfilled. As also mentioned in the prophecy of Ezekiel 38, Russia, Germany, and the EU and Turkey also have their own current degrees of geopolitical relationships between one another based on their own individual needs of convenience, in which I'll let you further investigate on your own. However, I will note that these nations do not have a great historical and or current track record with the Jewish people and the current nation state of Israel. The primary thing in which all these nations have in common is that they were and are currently home to several Jewish communities, in which many are of direct lineage from the exiled ancient Israelites that once came from the ancient kingdoms of southern Judah and northern Israel, and are prophesied to one day be all brought back to a reestablished nation of Israel in preparation for the return of Christ. However, this won't come without wars and rumor of war, famines, pestilences, and all other things prophetic, which is all to be a sign to the entire believing and unbelieving world that the God of the Bible is indeed real and is coming back soon. Now, the concept of Zionism, which is the idea that modern-day Jews have some connection and rightful claim to return to their ancient land area, is getting a lot of negative attention. But let me just say that God is the biggest Zionist of them all, and all that resist this will have him to contend with, per Zechariah chapter 12 and 14, Amos chapter 9 verse 14 and 15, 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 10, Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 36, and Jeremiah chapter 33 verse 25 and 26, and many more passages which clearly state how that God in the last days will return the descendants of the ancient Israelites that he had scattered out from Israel back into the land of Israel to never be removed ever again, and that all that oppose this will be cut into pieces by him. So far, history has indeed proven that despite Israel and the Jewish people being barely a fraction of the total world population and surface area, the garbage bin of history is littered with the empires that have tried to exterminate the Jews, but clearly failed to do so. So, despite this continued prophetic Psalm 83 call for the destruction of the nation of Israel, in which we're all still seeing today, God indeed has a plan and purpose for the nation of Israel and the entire world that will be made plainly evident via the coming Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog army defeat there in the northern territory of Israel, as we'll soon see going forward. Here we see a topographical model of the nation of Israel, in which we are viewing from the south to the north. Noticing that Israel's northern territory is a mountainous region known as the Golan Heights, in which Israel gained full control of after the 1973 October Yom Kippur War, in which Syria, via the help of Russia, attacked Israel during the fall feast day of Yom Kippur, hoping to catch Israel off guard. But supernaturally, they lost the war and the area of the Golan Heights to Israel. Syria has wanted the Golan Heights back ever since, because since that time, Israel has made that region to flourish unlike it ever was while it was in the hands of the Syrians. However, Russia, for the first time ever, entered militarily into Syria on September 30th, 2015, just 2 days after the infamous final blood moon of that month and year, in which was the last of 4 blood moons that occurred on Jewish feast days during 2014 and 2015. Russian military forces still reside on the Syrian side of the Golan border with Israel to this day, while the former exiled Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, sits in refuge there in Russia currently. Russia has since been tied up with their invasion of Ukraine, but will eventually be turned back to the Middle East region to attack Israel via their northern Golan border with Syria, especially now that Russia has been steadily collecting and assisting their new prophetic end-time Islamic allies of the likes of Russia, Libya, and Ethiopia, as listed in Ezekiel chapter 38. Eventually, a major provocative action taken by Israel, such as an attack that could result in the death of Russian soldiers in Syria, along with a global economic collapse, could be the right combination of events to provoke Russia and their allies to turn back from their European pursuits to instead launch a blitz attack against a seemingly isolated Israel via their northern Golan border for the purpose of taking a precise spoil of goods of silver, gold, and cattle specifically. Such an attack will surely be a free-for-all amongst these opportunistic frenemy nations, in which are described to turn against one another as God destroys their multinational coalition army there within the plains of Israel's northern mountainous Golan territory, one day during the fall Jewish feast day season months of September and October of some year just ahead. Here are examples of a kibbutz and moshav, which are highly flourishing and productive unwalled villages of Israel's northern Golan territory, in which the world via the UN have continually declared to be an illegal violation of international law. Israel constantly faces both regional and international threats and pressure to either give up this northern territory to their enemy neighbors or face an eventual seizure attempt via military force, which is precisely prophesied to occur in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. To note that this area of the Golan Heights was once an arid wasteland before the Jews gained control of these territories from their enemy neighbors, which lost control of this area as a result of their failed first strike attempt against the new nation of Israel, which miraculously gained and maintained control of this precise territory ever since 1967. On March 25, 2019, tensions only flared over this precise area of Israel, in which U.S. President Donald Trump unilaterally recognized Israel's sovereign right to the Golan Heights, after which Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu named a future planned settlement area there after Trump, called Trump Heights, or Ramat Trump in Hebrew. This only further drew the ire of the international community, which is chomping at the bit for the chance to come take this region by force. The new Syrian president, Ahmed al-Shara, whom was recently a most wanted Islamic terrorist, was recently hosted in the White House by U.S. President Donald Trump and stated that he was willing to allow Trump to negotiate a settlement between Syria and Israel in regard to Israel withdrawing from southern Syrian territory. However, any attempt at moving Israel away from this territory will result in Israel destroying Damascus in a single night strike per Isaiah chapter 17, which will surely trigger a global economic collapse and thus the Ezekiel 38 and 39 invasion against Israel to attempt to seize the Golan Heights once and for all. The cattle of the Golan Heights per Ezekiel 38. Israel has the best cattle in the world there in the Golan Heights. Russian interests. Russia and Israel signed an agreement in 2016 to cooperate on advanced dairy technology, which led to the Russian Direct Investment Fund and LR Group jointly investing $100 million in 2017. The goal was to improve Russia's dairy industry by using Israeli expertise and technology to develop large-scale dairy farms. This includes training Russian farmers, establishing a consortium of up to 1 million dairy cows, and using innovative technologies for efficiency. And that technology comes there from within the Golan Heights. Silver and gold per Ezekiel 38. We are seeing all-time record high prices for both silver and gold ever since 2015, when Russia first entered into Syria to assist in their civil war. Since that time, the prices of both silver and gold have quadrupled in value and are likely to go even higher in the future as the global financial system teeters on the brink of collapse, which will unleash silver and gold's full price potential at that time and will thus trigger a world war over their procurement by many nations. Ezekiel 38 states that Israel will have more than enough silver and gold that will entice Russia and their allies to invade to steal it. This indicates that Israel will somehow have plenty of silver and gold on hand, in addition to that of the price of silver and gold will be valued high enough for Russia and their allies to want to even risk to invade to steal it, which indicates the likelihood of a global economic crisis being a factor at which time will provoke the nations to come for it. Notably, Israel indeed has significant deposits of silver and gold in their territory. Haggai 2:8 states that silver and gold belong to God, so it is likely that God has deposited a large amount of both silver and gold within his beloved land of Israel, and that it might eventually be discovered for the world to want to come and take it by force. If not, we also see the likelihood that God brings the Jews out from the host nations that he scattered them into back into the land of Israel during these last days, in which they will take with them the wealth of their host nations as they did during the ancient exodus from Egypt, which provoked the Egyptians to come after them for a spoil, but resulted in their supernatural destruction by God. So similarly will happen with the Ezekiel 38-39 northern army destruction as they come to take a spoil from the Jews. But that destruction won't be by water, but will rather be by volcanic fire. It's interesting to note that the acronym for the U.S.-based energy company, Genie Oil and Gas, is GOG, G-O-G, which just so happens to also be the name of the demonic spirit that provokes the nations of Ezekiel 38-39 to invade Israel in order to fulfill their evil wish of taking a spoil of key resources from Israel's northern territory of the Golan Heights, in which in ancient times was known as Bashan, and was ruled by a giant pagan king named Og, which is mentioned throughout the Old Testament in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, Deuteronomy, chapters 1 and 3, Joshua, chapters 12 and 13. Og was likely one of the Nephilimic fallen angel offspring, with the early daughters of men, noted in Genesis chapter 6, and also after the flood, and was possibly even the offspring of the chief prince called Gog, that is said to be the ruling principality spirit there in the northern territory of Israel. So the ancient king Og of Bashan, or the Golan Heights, just might be derived from his likely father, whose name could be Gog. Along that train of thought, it's also interesting that the word genie is derived from the Arabic word jinn, which is used to refer to deceptive demonic spirits, which are often depicted as genies that are loosed from enchanted vessels that go about granting humans their wishes, but ultimately lead toward their demise, unlike the more pleasantly popularized children's fables. Notice that the logo of Genie Oil and Gas is that of the cliche image of a genie's lamp. Genie just so happened to have discovered and confirmed the presence of a large deposit of oil and natural gas there within the Golan Heights in October of 2015, which was just a few days after Russia first entered into Syria that same year, and still have a small Russian military presence there at Israel's northern Golan border that was most recently renewed this November 2025, despite Russia's current war in Ukraine. Coincidence? I think not. Preparation for the future invasion of Israel? Yes. Earthquakes, pillars of smoke, fire and brimstone all describe volcanic activity per Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Ezekiel chapter 39 precisely mentions the area of Bashan. Bashan is the ancient name for the Golan Heights, which is an area settled by returning Jewish exiles. Today, the Golan Heights is a strategic area for Israel, known for its agricultural bounty, and is the place for the future invasion of the Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog army, sometime in the fall feast day months of September and October of some year ahead. Now, beyond coincidence, the Golan Heights is home to a series of dormant volcanoes, in which is commonly referred to as the Israeli Tell Line. There is a similar sequence of volcanoes located on the other side of the Golan border in Syria. Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39 describes how that one day God will erupt this dormant volcanic range upon the invading Gog and Magog army as they enter into this region to take a spoil of key resources from Israel. This event will shake the entire globe and destroy the current Temple Mount structure there in Jerusalem, and will be a time in which I think that the rapture will be synchronized with and masked by during the prophetic fall feast days in September and October of some year ahead. Now, many religious Jews also believe that this war of Gog and Magog will occur and conclude during the fall feast day of Sukkot of some year soon, and after which will be when the messianic figure that they anticipate will arise amidst the chaos and will be heralded by the sound of an audibly loud global shofar sound, in which the rapture is also correlated to that of a loud shofar sound as well. Coincidence? I think not. The Avital Volcanic Park in Israel. The Golan Heights is a basaltic plateau in southwestern Syria, known for its dormant volcanic features. It is part of the Harat Ash-Sha'am volcanic field, which is the largest volcanic field in western Arabia. The Golan Heights includes numerous cinder cones and dormant volcanoes, such as those in the Kav Hatalim Israeli area, which are popular for hiking and nature trails. The volcanic landscape is characterized by steep slopes and a variety of geological formations, making it a significant geographical feature in the region. If you're ever in Israel, go to the north and visit this before the eruption. If not, check out Israel Live Tours there on YouTube and look up the video of Avital Volcanic Park there in the Golan Heights. Pretty interesting. The dormant and active volcanoes in the Ezekiel 38 nations. Yes, there are volcanoes in Russia, Iran, Libya, Turkey, Germany, and many of the EU nations, as well as Ethiopia, which just had their first unexpected volcanic eruption in their history just this month, this year, 2025. Coincidence? I think not. God is going to slowly start warming up these dormant and active volcanoes in response to the coming invasion of these nations into the nation of Israel at the Golan Heights. Sometime in the fall season of September-October, God will erupt these volcanoes, specifically that in the Golan Heights and around the world, which will be a warning and major sign to the world that God is real. It will be a masking event for the rapture, which I believe will take place at that same time of some year ahead. So be on the watch for further seismic activity in which God will shake the earth and create smoke, pillars, and fires and earthquakes, fire and brimstone that will rain down from heaven, destroying all these nations that come against Israel. Let's review some key details within the book of Ezekiel, chapter 39. First, we see that God leaves a sixth part of the Gog and Magog army alive, as they come from the north parts and are destroyed there upon the mountains of Israel in the Golan Heights. God then says that he will smite the bow out of their left hand and will cause thine arrows to fall out of their right hand. I'll discuss this in another slide to come. But next we see that God says that I will give the Gog and Magog army bodies unto the ravenous birds of every sort to feast upon, after he burns them with fire. And also that he will destroy those that dwell carelessly in the isles, which I think is a reference to the Mediterranean islands, specifically that of Cyprus, which might hold also some of the Gog and Magog army soldiers, which think they will have escaped destruction, but God will likewise destroy them via the volcanic eruption. Notably, the island of Cyprus is home to a dormant volcanic range as well. Next, we see that God says that he will bless Israel for 7 years after he destroys the Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog army. Then we see that God will give a place in Israel for a gravesite, a mass gravesite, for the dead bodies of the Gog and Magog army to go. That it will be in the area of the Valley of the Passengers, which I believe to be is the Jordan Valley, and that will be in the east of the sea, which could be either that of the Sea of Galilee in the north or the Dead Sea down in the south, which we'll discuss that later. And that ultimately this area will stop up the nose of the passerbys, which would require the use of men of continual employment to have to seek and find the dead bodies that are marked by special markers by the passerbyers. And this will take place for a period of 7 months, in which it says that those that remain upon the face of the earth will search even after the 7 months. Could this be a reference to the rapture event, in which there's people that remain on the earth after the rapture that will then search and look for those that no longer remain on the earth because of the rapture? Time will tell. Again, we see that God calls every feathered fowl, which are migratory birds, in the spring and/or in the fall, which are the 2 migratory seasons, which we'll see later, to come and gather themselves to God's sacrifice that he performs for Israel there on the mountains of Israel. And we see then the mention specifically of the word Bashan, which is the ancient name of Golan Heights. Noticing that God calls this event his sacrifice that he performs, which is a subtle reference to what I think is the feast day, the fall feast day of Sukkot, in which there was a massive burnt offering that was performed in reverence to God. So I think God is subtly showing that he is performing this feast day in fulfillment of what that is picturing, and that he burns these multiple nations there upon the mountain of Israel, in which in ancient times there in Israel, burnt sacrifices were performed on the mountaintops. So God appears to be performing this subtle feast day picture thereby this event. Potentially that will take place likewise during the fall feast days of Sukkot. Time will tell. The Gog and Magog War, first described in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, is a totally separate war from that of the Revelation chapter 20 Gog and Magog War. I think we have enough scriptural details to see that the Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog War occurs before the Gog and Magog War described in the book of Revelation chapter 20. Let's compare and contrast some of the details here. The Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog War is said to occur in the latter years, in which 1/6 of Gog and Magog are left alive by God, and is a northern invasion exclusively, and is against unwalled Jewish villages there in the Golan Heights, Bashan, versus the Revelation chapter 20 Gog and Magog War, which details that it occurs at the end of the millennial reign, and that all of Gog and Magog are destroyed by God. And this invasion is a surrounding invasion that encircles the camp of the saints. Therefore, I think we have enough information to conclude that these are two separate wars based on these details alone. So this is how I think God may destroy Gog's bow and arrows in Ezekiel chapter 39, which I think is a reference to Hezbollah's rockets in Iran's nuclear site, which is the chief of their might, per Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 35, in which God states that he will break the bow of Elam, which is an area there in Iran that borders the Persian Gulf and is home to the Bushehr nuclear site, in which both Germany and Russia have assisted Iran in building, and in whom are also notable Ezekiel 38 allies. The correlation to this site being a bow is significant in that this area holds the chief of Iran's might, which is their nuclear capacity, in which they hope to one day launch a nuclear missile, like an arrow from a bow, over into Israel one day. Thankfully, they will never get the chance to do that, as this specific nuclear facility in Iran sits near an active fault line in the region and has experienced several earthquakes in recent time. So even though America and Israel have recently struck a few of Iran's nuclear facilities, it will be God who takes out this particular chief site in Iran via an earthquake, per Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 35. Now the right hand of Gog is presumed to be that of Hezbollah in Lebanon, with all their rockets that they threaten to launch into Israel. So if Gog is the head of this multinational force against Israel, its left hand would be in the area of that of Iran, and the right hand would be in the area that of Lebanon, in which they have the symbolic weaponry designated to attack Israel. But God, thankfully, has plans of disarming them. The 7 years of Ezekiel 39. Joel chapter 2, verses 15 through 24 describes the same event of Ezekiel 38 and 39, in which God blesses Israel after destroying this end of days northern army that comes at the time of the blowing of the shofar, at which time the bridegroom, Christ, meets the bride, the church, aka the rapture. God says that he will make himself known to the nations by the way he destroys the Gog and Magog army. So what's the need of the church at that point and or going forward if God declares himself to the world via such a massive event? This is why I think that the rapture occurs in tandem with the destruction of the Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog army. Should this synchronous event occur in the fall season in the Gregorian year of 2060, or the corrected Jewish year of 5986, as described and discussed in part 1 of this video, I think it will initiate the 7 years of plenty in which God says that he will bless Israel with for 7 continual years, in which the Antichrist and false prophet will likely come on the scene to take credit for, thus deceiving many at first, as they will be peaceable to the Jews during this first 7-year period by performing many lying signs and wonders. Both these end-time figures will likely be of Jewish descent and or be prominent military and or geopolitical figures already at the time in which the Ezekiel 38-39 Gog and Magog War occur, so that Israel will receive them as the new leaders of the nation of Israel at such a chaotic time in their history. These leaders will appear to bring order to chaos during this 7 years, in which only Israel will be blessed, while the rest of the world is devastated. The Temple Mount complex will be badly damaged, thus destroying the current Islamic Golden Dome of the Rock Mosque atop it, as well as other parts of Israel that will be badly damaged as a result of the massive earthquake and volcanic eruptions that would have occurred during the Ezekiel 38-39 Gog and Magog destruction. But the Antichrist and false prophet will lead a rebuilding campaign at that time, which will also include the building of the new third temple on the ruins of the Temple Mount complex. As with the pattern found with King Solomon, who built the first temple during the 4th year of his reign, is likely a prelude to how the Antichrist will likely start building the third temple in the 4th year of his reign, and will take 7 years, like it did with King Solomon, to finish building the temple, which would take him to the midpoint of the 7 years of tribulation, in which is when the 2 witnesses will be killed for preaching against this false Messiah and the abomination of desolation of this third temple, when Christ is the true temple and final sacrifice. Please feel free to take a moment to pause the video and review some of the details of the 14-year timeline that I've listed here. The 7 months mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 39 states that it takes Israel precisely 7 months to bury the dead of the defeated Gog and Magog army. This detail is not arbitrary, and that based on subtle details within Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, we see that the destruction of the Gog and Magog army happens in a precise location and at a precise time of year, which is likely to be within the fall season, which is when the final 3 fall feast days of the Lord occur at, which happen from mid-September to mid-October every year. So 7 months from that time in the fall takes us to mid-April to mid-May, which is precisely when the spring feasts of Passover occurs. What's unique about both the fall and spring feasts is that they are connected to when ancient Israel appointed kings. Noting that the Jews sought to make Jesus king during the spring feast day of Passover, per John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. I think the Antichrist will follow this pattern as Satan desires to be like God, per Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 14. So as you can see, I enlarged the first portion of my final 14-year diagram so that I can emphasize this precise 7-month time frame from the prophetic fall season feast day of Sukkot, in which I think the Ezekiel 38-39 Gog and Magog War and Rapture will occur around, to the time of the prophetic feast day of Passover in the spring, which is indeed 7 months. This is not likely a coincidence, as many religious Jewish groups believe that the Ezekiel 38-39 Gog and Magog War will occur and conclude during the fall season feast day of Sukkot, or Tabernacles. And if true, 7 months later takes us to Passover in the spring, which is within the time frame in which ancient Israel appointed and coronated their kings, and are likely to do the same in the future with the Antichrist. So the Antichrist will likely be crowned as the new leader of Israel after being perceived to be the messianic figure and leader that destroyed the invading Gog and Magog army, and thus saving Israel. This idea will likely be reinforced by the sounding of the global shofar, in which also is to accompany the rapture, and will be followed by the prophesied period of 7 years of blessing, in which God promised to bring after he destroys this northern army, per Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39 and Joel chapter 2. But the Antichrist and false prophet will likely also take responsibility for this prophetic period of blessing, which will be part of the great deception that is also prophesied to trick many into receiving him as kind, and will therefore be willing to confirm another 7-year covenant with him after this initial period of 7 years of blessing is completed. And like the pattern found in King Solomon, per 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, the Antichrist will likely commission the rebuilding of the third temple during the 4th year of his reign, from the time of the destruction of the Gog and Magog army and synchronized and massed rapture of the church that would have happened just 4 years prior. Lastly, Ezekiel chapter 39 verse 14 makes a cryptic statement of those that remain upon the face of the earth, condoning that there are people that were taken off from the face of the earth. Could be a subtle indication of the rapture event during the cataclysmic distraction of God destroying the Gog and Magog army via a global earthquake and series of volcanic eruptions. Something of that magnitude would indeed be enough to mask the rapture event. The Sukkot, or tabernacles, burnt sacrifice that God will perform, per Ezekiel chapter 39. If you want to learn more about the Feast of Sukkot, or tabernacles, I advise that you go to the book of Numbers, chapter 29, verse 12 through 34. Also, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 34 through 43, and Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 13 through 15. And note how God describes this as being a sacrifice in which he performs via the destruction of the Gog and Magog army there upon the mountains of Israel via a fiery destruction. Gog and Magog will burn, as described in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38-39, in which God says that he will hook in their jaws like a cattle with a nose ring and a mouth muzzle, as he leads them down into Israel on the northern mountainous region that are dormant volcanoes, that he will erupt and thus burn them as a living sacrifice, in which he states that he will perform on behalf of Israel, which will likely take place in the prophetic fall season in which this feast is said to occur at, thus fulfilling the picture of that feast day. Only time will tell, but it seems to fit the pattern of what we read in Scripture. So study this out and see if it seems to correlate with that. The birds of prey in the Golan Heights, per Ezekiel chapter 39. The ravenous birds, such as vultures, are part of the migratory birds that fly through Israel twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall season. So God describes that he will be giving a burnt sacrifice feast of roasted Gog and Magog soldiers to these migratory birds starting in the fall season and will extend over into the next migratory season in the spring after 7 months' time. The Gamla Nature Reserve in the Golan Heights is the precise area in which many of these carnivorous migratory birds flock to, and will be at the location in which they will feast upon the sacrificed Gog and Magog bodies. The Valley of the Passengers is referencing the Jordan Valley and its longest highway of Route 90. Which runs from the northernmost point of Israel to the southernmost point of Israel. Route 90 is the longest road in Israel and is about 300 miles long. It was built in the 1960s but follows an ancient trade route known as the Valley of the Passengers. The newest section of this highway are 50 years old, paved after the 1967 Six-Day War, while the oldest sections of this highway are those of the northernmost section of the highway from Tiberias to Metula, which were constructed during the time of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. With only one lane going north and one lane going south, Route 90 stretches from Metula and the northern border with Lebanon, along the western side of the Sea of Galilee, through the Jordan River Valley, along the western bank of the Dead Sea, and through the Araba Valley until you reach the southernmost town of Eilat, at the southern border with Egypt on the Red Sea. The road was assigned the number 90 in the early 1980s. The section where it passes the Dead Sea, known as the Dead Sea Highway, is the lowest road in the world. Masada, En Gedi Nature Reserve, Qumran Caves, and Ahava are located along this stretch of the road. The future Haman Gog burial site of the dead bodies of the Gog and Magog army will also be a feature adjacent to this highway sometime in the future, fittingly near the Dead Sea, in which will be the future location of the mass grave for the Gog and Magog army's dead bodies. Now let's review some key details of the book of Joel chapter 2, in which depicts the destruction of the Ezekiel 38-39 northern Gog and Magog army in the fall season, in which the Jews will be fasting, weeping, and mourning, and wondering if God will return and repent and leave a blessing behind him, indicating that he's passing through and no longer here, likely because of the rapture of the church, in which he has taken the church up into heaven and left the unbelieving Jewish people behind, in which that are hoping that he leave behind a meat offering and a drink offering, in which I think is referencing the sacrifice destruction of the Gog and Magog army soldiers, in which their bodies and blood will be that of a meat and drink offering for the ravenous migratory birds that will be passing through that area. Then we see, blow the trumpet in Zion, sanctify a fast, and call a solemn assembly, which is all referencing that of the feast of Yom Kippur, and or the 8th day of Sukkot, which is also known as the solemn assembly. However, the 8th day of Sukkot and the last day of Passover are associated with that term, but the key differentiating factor is the concept of a trumpet being blown, which Yom Kippur is only one of two feast days, the fall feast days of trumpets and Yom Kippur, which have aspects of trumpets being blown. And it's also a time in which the whole congregation of Israel are required to be in Israel, to be gathered together as a congregation of elders and infants, which is also a time in which it says here specifically that the bridegroom will go forth of his chamber, Jesus out of heaven, and the bride out of her closet, the church out of the earth. So this, I believe, is depicting the rapture event at this time of the fall feast of Yom Kippur, in which the northern army is coming to invade Israel. Here we see in verse 17, it said, let the priests, the ministers of the Lord, weep between the porch and the altar, which I believe is what happens every year at this time in the fall of Yom Kippur, where the Jewish religious people get there to the Wailing Wall and will weep during a time of fasting and deep reflection and hope that their sins will be covered for that year and the coming year. But notice that this time will be different in that they will say, spare thy people, O Lord, and give not thine heritage to a reproach that the heathen should rule over them. Meaning that they're likely being invaded at this time by the heathen of the northern Gog and Magog army. At that time, God will then be jealous for his land and pity his people amidst this multinational invasion that he is now set up to hopefully get the Jews to believe in him. So, and this again is referencing the land of Israel and the Jews, that he's pitying his land and his people. In verse 19, it says, yea, the Lord will answer and say unto his people, the Jews, behold, I will send you corn, wine, and oil, and ye shall be satisfied therewith. And I will no more make you, the Jews, a reproach among the heathen. Because in this event, God destroys the Gog and Magog nation and only leaves the 6 of them behind. So Israel, when the smoke clears, will be the premier nation of the world, in which the 6 that are left behind will come to Israel to seek refuge and resources as the nation of Israel rebuilds under the unfortunate receipt of the Antichrist at that time. But here we say, God says in verse 20 that he will remove far off from them the northern army, which again is referencing the Ezekiel 38-39 northern army of Gog and Magog, and that he will drive him, Gog, into a land barren and desolate, with his face toward the east sea, and his hinder part toward the utmost sea. And his stink shall come up, and his ill savor shall come up. I think this is referencing that how God will destroy the Gog and Magog army in the north via the volcanic eruptions, in which that Highway 90 will have to cart the dead bodies down to the east part of the sea, the Dead Sea, which fittingly is the Dead Sea, which these dead bodies will have to go to down there in that barren wasteland of an area, in which will be the future mass grave called Haman Gog. Then we see the reference of a fig-bearing tree, which again brings us back to the nation of Israel in Luke chapter 21, which is, behold the fig tree, and that they will begin to bear fruit and yield their strength, which figs in Israel begin to bear early figs during April in the spring, and then they fully ripen and are ready for harvest in the fall. And it says here in the first month. The first month can either be that of April or September. In modern times, the nation of Israel observes the first technical month as September. There's an agricultural and ceremonial calendar. In the ceremonial calendar, April technically of Passover, when they did the Passover lamb, the first month is April. But now that Israel no longer observes the sacrificial system, they view the first month or the head of the year as September, which is technically the 7th month. But either or, that 7-month time frame between September and April is also referenced in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, in which if the Ezekiel 38 and 39 destruction of the northern Gog and Magog army occur in the fall, September, during the Feast of Yom Kippur, and in synchronization with the rapture around that time at the last trumpet, 7 months later takes you to April anyway, in which God says ultimately the floor shall be full of wheat. Wheat is an attribute and agricultural harvest of the spring feasts, and that ultimately Israel will overflow with resources. And this, I think, indicates the 7 years of restorative plenty that are mentioned to come during the Ezekiel 38 and 39 chapters after God destroys the Gog and Magog army. Unfortunately, Israel will receive the Antichrist at this time that will lay claim to these blessings and deceive the nation of Israel, ultimately for another 7 years of leadership rule, in which he'll break halfway through. But as we see that it will be God, God, will restore to you, Israel, those years that in which these entities try to destroy and take from Israel. Now later we see that God, after this event, after this event, which I think comes about 10 years after the destruction of the Gog and Magog army and the rapture, that the 144,000 Jewish people will get the power of the Holy Spirit. Because it says here, and it shall come to pass afterward, after what? The destruction of the northern army, and when the bride and the bridegroom meet, that afterward that God will pour out his Spirit upon all flesh pertaining to Israel, and your sons and your daughters, the Jewish people, shall prophesy, and your old men, the Jews, shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. I don't think this is anything in relation to how the charismatic use this verse. I think this is in direct relation in the context that the 144,000 Jews will get converted at that time during the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation to then go out and preach the gospel amidst the time of the Antichrist rule and reign. And then here we see in verse 30 that God will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth with blood, fire, and pillars of smoke. Again, a reference to the Ezekiel 38 and 39 global volcanic eruptions and disasters that occur before the second coming of the Lord. Noting that in verse 31, the sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come, which is the second coming, of which we'll see a massive amount of destruction of the nations, forcing them to come to Israel before the second coming of Christ at that time, in which we see a reference of the remnant, meaning those left behind to experience those things. So study this out further in detail and see if it really does fit with Ezekiel 38 and 39, and that the rapture could be synchronized with that destruction of the northern army, in which Israel will be left behind to be a world premier nation under the leadership of the Antichrist, which later the 144,000 will get supernaturally converted to receive the Holy Spirit and be able to go about preaching the gospel to the end of the age and the second coming of Christ with the saints that were raptured out previously. Like Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, Joel chapter 2 also seems to indicate the same event of the destruction of the northern army being destroyed by God in the fall season is described to be also the time in which the bridegroom and the bride meet, around the fall feast of Rosh Hashanah, or Feast of Trumpets, and Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, which is the time of the last trumpet in which the rapture occurs at, and also at which God destroys the Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog northern army. This is especially significant if it is to occur during a pregnant Jewish leap year during the final Jubilee. Notice here that Solomon's porch is indeed the Wailing Wall, in which every year in fall season during Yom Kippur, the Jewish people gather and wail and cry and weep, seeking sparing from God for that coming year. Then we see that is one of only two feasts, which are both in the fall, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in which a shofar is blown. It's time for a prophetic status report. All the conditions and necessary elements of end-time Bible prophecy are converging and playing out like never before. Israel is becoming more and more isolated and hated on the world stage. The merchants of Tarshish, Britain, and their young lions, America, have allied with Sheba and Dedan, Saudi Arabia, in which Britain has left the EU, Gomer and their bands, via the Brexit on January 31st, 2020, amidst the rise of an Eastern Economic Coalition of Nations, in which BRICS is a rising economic bloc of nations that seek to usurp the global economic dominance of the West. But it will likely be that of Russia, who is currently invading Ukraine, that will make a blitz attempt at rising to the top with their Islamic Ezekiel 38 and 39 allies as they come to invade a seemingly isolated and prosperous nation of Israel amidst the decline of the Western powers due to a coming global economic collapse, which will take place around the fall season of some year ahead and will unleash the floodgate of prophetic end-time events, starting with the synchronized rapture event with the destruction of the Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog army, sometime during the fall feast days of some year ahead, which could likely be by the year 2060. So could we only have 36 years left to go from this current year of 2025 until the year 2060, in which could be the rapture and Ezekiel 38 and 39 Gog and Magog War destruction, in which could both be synchronized events that occur in the fall feast days that could then unleash the final 14-year prophetic events that lead up to the potential 2074 physical return of Christ? Well, only time will tell. All we can do is watch and see and pray and share the gospel with others. So thanks for joining me today as we ponder the prophetic. Please join me next time as we dive into the final 14 years. Lastly, I'd like to present the gospel good news message, in that there is only one way in which we can be saved from the eternal consequences of our sins, which is the bad news of a coming judgment day for all of us, in which all of us will be found guilty and will face the punishment of eternal hell and separation from God. Luke chapter 23, verse 32 through 34 records how there were two criminals that were crucified next to Jesus Christ, and that while one criminal mocked Jesus, the other criminal expressed his belief in Jesus as being God in the form of a sinless man, and that in comparison to that, we mere mortals justly deserve death for our sinful criminal deeds, and that we need to ask Jesus as our Lord to remember us upon our judgment day. Like this thief heard from Christ, we too should likewise expect to have the same assurance of salvation from hell as this thief had, if we simply believe and confess likewise. So please consider the questions of, who is Christ to you? And what kind of criminal are you in comparison to Luke chapter 23? Are you a dying doubter or an alive believer? So with that said, that's it for today, folks. If you have any questions or constructive feedback, or if you want to learn more about how to be saved, or to let me know that you've decided to call upon the Lord Jesus to remember you at Judgment Day, please feel free to write me in the comment section, or you can email me at final14years@gmail.com. Again, that's final14years@gmail.com, and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. So until then, thank you for sticking around and pondering the prophetic with me, and please join me in the next videos as we continue to dive into the final 14 years.